Hey guys, good morning. I'm recording this on Wednesday. It's a little bit early and I'm still getting going. But what we need to do is give you some framework as you enter the letters and start doing some reading and some processing on what's going on in the letters. Just as by way of recap, I know Mr. Gillens is going to help walk you through it, and he's got the set of instructions that you need for today in class. But what I want you to do today is read through the Johannine letters, okay? Primarily First John. If you get through First John and you want to take a look at Second and Third, great, go for it. But we need to get through First John today. What I would like you to do when you're done reading First John is consider the things that you just read and heard in First John that remind you of things Jesus has said, specifically things Jesus has said from the Gospel of John. And if there are some other notes on major themes, I think this is really important. Great, go ahead and make those additional notes. But I want your focus to be on what have I heard in First John that sounds a lot like things Jesus was teaching the disciples or the crowds that were coming out of Jesus's mouth in the gospel. There's a good deal of material between some of the themes and ideas in the text of John, the gospel, that also lead us into some of the themes and ideas that saturate the letters, especially First John. And then we can kind of work from there with the rest of the letters, with what's going on with them, pulling on key themes. And then later on in the semester, we'll do a deep dive on the letters themselves and do some exegetical and hermeneutical work. We'll be pulling on some threads and trying to do some of the interpretation. So what I want to do is set the stage. Letters are different than Gospels. Letters are different than Gospels. Gospels and letters are different than apocalyptic writing. And John has a way of doing all three of those. So what we want to do is pay attention to the unique elements of the letters as we get into reading and trying to pull on themes that belong to the letters. One of the primary considerations when we talk about letters is the audience. Now, we get snippets in the letters. We know that Third John is written to an individual, and it's written about another one as a kind of reference letter. We'll talk more about that when we get to it. We know that Second John is addressed to the elect lady and her children, which just about everybody has said that's got to be a church. The elect lady is a church, and her children are the people that make up the congregation. John also says that this elect lady that he's writing to is greeted by her sister. So kind of like we do with cars and trains and ships, we talk about them as a feminine, as she. It seems like that's kind of what John is doing with the church. And that makes a little bit of sense considering some of the theology that leads us to a statement about the bride of Christ and this kind of thing. But that's just where we're at. So he writes Second John to the elect lady and her children. And it's written from him as the elder who's primarily responsible for these churches and congregations. Now, he's probably got a pastoral presence in the city of the elect lady. And that pastoral presence is somebody for John like a Timothy or a Titus was for Paul. We don't necessarily know who that is or what's going on, but we know that there are some individuals who have been left in charge to help run and steer these congregations. We know some of them by name when we get to Third John, because as he walks us through the material in Third John, he writes to an individual whose name is Gaius. And so writing to Gaius sort of gives us a clue. Maybe Gaius is leading this particular church and he's looking at replacing some leadership. So we know there's a pastoral presence that's leading these churches. We know that John is sort of leading that pastoral group from afar. There isn't anything specific that would link the letters to any one of the specific churches that get mentioned for us in the book of Revelation. If we take the seven churches in Revelation as kind of a starting point for churches that John is responsible for in some sense, then the elect lady is most likely the city of Ephesus. And we've talked about that. It's not foolproof, but it's definitely a leading candidate. Okay. Again, the Johannine community is a label that has been added in recent scholarship, relatively recently, to talk about the community of churches that John is leading and writing to as he writes things like the book of Revelation and the gospel and the letters. We're not entirely sure what that community consists of. Folks who are more inclined to traditional understandings of who John is writing to would say that, oh, that group that we now call the Johannine community must be at least the 7 churches of Revelation. Because it seems John has a particular relationship with those churches. It seems Jesus has a particular care and consideration for working through John for those churches. So this is our starting point, okay? Those 7 churches in Revelation give us a kind of framework. John's probably writing to those 7 churches as he writes the letters. The elect lady and her children might very well be the city of Ephesus because of its prominence, but there's no way to be 100% sure. Second, 1 John doesn't have an address, and we talked about this a little bit already, but because it does not, and 2 John does, it leads us to think about the content of 1 John as kind of like a circular letter. Paul writes a letter to the churches in Galatia. Galatia is not a particular city, it's a region. And so the thought process behind the letter to the Galatians is that Paul has written this letter to go to all of the churches in this region, to be shared amongst a group of churches and congregations. It would seem that 1 John sort of fits into a similar context. Hebrews might fit into a similar context. The standard features of a letter addressed to a particular congregation don't appear in 1 John like they do in other places, perhaps like 3 John. They don't appear in other places like the Corinthian letters do, where Paul addresses the churches in Corinth specifically. He addresses the church in Ephesus specifically, the church in Philippi specifically. For 1 John, there's no introduction, and so we're not entirely sure who he's writing to and what is going on in the particular context of that writing, because all of the introductory material that might mention some of that is missing. Now, the letter's still sort of structured and flows like we would expect a letter to be structured and flow. And it has an ending that even sounds a bit like a closing to a letter. It's got some, what feels like a closing when he says, I write these things to you who believe in the name, that you may know that you have eternal life. And then he talks about our confidence and dealing with some things related to sin. But that sounds like he's wrapping up his dialogue and his conversation. So what we think, 1 John is perhaps a circular. It's something that is meant to go to multiple churches and be the body of a message that's read amongst each of those individual congregations. And perhaps there is something like a 2 John that has the address and the greetings and the closing elements to it that goes with it, so that when whoever it is that's working with John goes to the church in Ephesus, they read the cover letter, 2 John perhaps, or something like it, and then they read the body of the text in 1 John. 2 John has a lot of the same basic points and elements as 1. It doesn't do as deep of a dive into those points because it's relatively short. So 2 John also seems to kind of sum up what's going on in the content of the letter. So what a lot of scholars have imagined and have proposed is that 1 John is meant to be a thoroughgoing reading and discussion of the ideas and the content. And 2 John is meant to be left with a particular church that it's addressed to, like in Ephesus, not only to serve to greet them for the content of the letter in 1 John, but also to be a kind of summary of the content they've already encountered in depth in 1 John, so that they have this shorter version that is a reminder of all of the things that they have been taught. Okay? Third John is a pastoral reference letter. Okay. John is trying to warn against a particular individual. I think his name is Diotrephes. Yes. And he is recommending Demetrius. So it's sort of like a pastoral letter of reference for whoever Gaius happens to be. Probably a local pastor who's looking at raising leaders for either a new house group, a new sort of spin-off congregation, or perhaps even taking his place as he's transitioning or doing something like that. So First and Second John seem to have an interesting relationship. They cover a lot of the same material. Second John seems to sum it up, but also has the address and the standard letter features that identify that for us. First John is a little bit more like something like Hebrews. It just jumps right in and starts in on the content. And so we tend to think that First John is the body of instruction and teaching, the letter or a speech that is to be given and read in a congregation. Second John might be a cover letter that went with it, so that as a messenger traveled from John to Ephesus, he carried the Ephesus cover letter and the body of First John, and he carried a cover letter for Pergamum and one for Sardis and Philadelphia and Laodicea and Thyatira and Smyrna and all of these places. And he would leave the cover letter for Ephesus with the church in Ephesus. Here's your reminder of all the things that we talked about that John is communicating to us, that we feel like the Spirit is saying, hey, these are important things to be paying attention to. And this is the letter that addresses you specifically. And then there might be some nuance as you go from that church in Ephesus to the church in Pergamum to the church in Sardis. But then the body of the material, the content of the material would be the same. So you write one big chunk because writing is expensive, and you write some smaller snippets to greet and introduce the concepts, be ways of reminders for the concepts to the individual congregations to which the circular letter of First John is going. Third John's a pastoral reference letter written to Gaius, warning him against Diotrephes and encouraging him to embrace Demetrius. These function a lot like letters. So when we think about the letters of Paul or the letters of John or the letter of the Hebrews, there's a blending here of theological content and instruction and practical life application. And that's what we're going to try and pay attention to as we study the letters. So from here forward, go and read 1 John. Okay. If you want to take a look at 2 John, that's fine, but go and read 1 John. And I want you to do some comparative work between what you're hearing and reading and encountering in the letter of 1 John and what's going on with the Gospel of John. What concepts, what ideas, what themes, what significant points are the same between those two? And in particular, what do I hear in 1 John that I hear Jesus talking about in the Gospels? It'd be good to include references so we know where to cross-reference this material. It would be probably helpful for you at some point in time as we process this and as you do some of the writing that we're going to do this semester. Okay. Hopefully this was a good start. Read 1 John, compare to the Gospels, especially with what Jesus has to say. And then we will debrief all of that when we get back together on Tuesday, because it's a long weekend coming and you have Monday off. So enjoy the time, guys, and we will see you when we're back together.